All right. Good morning. So the title of this session, as mentioned, is Building Companies Out of Resilient Technology. And so we're going to actually cover the actual building of companies, but I have to say up front that both of these two guys have fantastic companies that are not only exhibiting, but they're also talking throughout the conference. So I would say, when you have time, definitely find a way to hear from both Cody and Carl. Well, let me hop in a bit by describing my background and why it is that I am the moderator. So we're talking about building companies out of resilient technologies, which takes you from A to Z, from all the way from identifying the problem to providing a solution. My background is, I've got an academic background in chemistry and material science. I took that into being an entrepreneur, and today I'm an investor for a firm that I co-founded called Material Impact. And so I've spent a lot of time looking at how do you commercialize technology centered around real-world problems. And more importantly, I've had a chance to work with some fantastic people like these two gentlemen who are on the stage today. So, just hopping in a bit, I'd like each of them, Cody, maybe we start with you, just to introduce yourself, and then Carl, I'm going to come and ask you to introduce yourself, and then I'm going to frame a bit the way I know all three of us think, and certainly the way Material Impact thinks about the recipe, if you will, of building companies out of resilient technologies. Cody?
Thank you, Carmichael. My name's Cody Friesen. I'm the founder and CEO of Zero Mass Water. My background is as a material scientist. I did a PhD at MIT in material science, and I'm a professor of material science at Arizona State University. And in my research group and in the company, we really focus on problem-oriented, grand problem-oriented problems, and really start from that basis and then go build technologies that in some cases turn into companies that then go and scale globally. And so I'm particularly excited to sit on this panel and chat because it really aligns with my ethos around how do we develop technologies that not only scale from the lab to the marketplace, but also solve grand problems and do that in a resilient way in every variation of the term resiliency.
Exactly. And Carl?
So I'm Carl Vause. I'm the CEO of Soft Robotics Incorporated. Very similar to what Cody said is I've worked across a variety of industries, but I consider myself very much a product technologist, if that makes sense. And my ethos is really around find great technologies, find real problems in the world, and then figure out how to take those technologies, develop a product that solves that problem in an economic manner that you can deliver to market in a product to build a great company and be successful.
Excellent. So we hear commonality already that both of them are very product focused. Let me shape a little bit of the recipe, if you will. It certainly is the recipe that we use at Material Impact when we're focused on, as Cody said, grand problems. And what we mean by that are, the kind of things that help keep the world healthy, safe, fed, warm, secure, and powered. The kind of things that matter to everyone, really matter. So there are three things that if we summarize a bit, that are the menu, if you will, for building a company out of resilient technologies. It starts with identifying what the problem is, the grand problem. Then it goes towards the solution, which is most often technical, and sourcing that. And then comes what I would argue is the most difficult part, bridging the gap to commercialization after you've done that. So I'm going to ask these two gentlemen to give their own account of how they addressed each of those segments. And we're going to start off, Cody, by you talking a little bit about the problem that you saw, and that is what Zero Mass Water is addressing.
Yeah, so probably the most scarce resource on this planet is good drinking water, right? You think about how you get your water at your home. Do you get it in a bottle? Do you filter it? Do you rely on the government? Unlike every other absolutely necessary element of our life, so you think about the 3 threes, right? You have 3 minutes to death without air, 3 days to death without water, 3 weeks to death without food. In the case of air, you just take a breath and you own it. In the case of food, even in a relatively poverty-stricken area, there's many pathways to food. In the wealthiest country in the world, you often have 1 or 2 pathways to water. And so the question became, how do we fundamentally shift the the nature of water, how do we think about going from the status quo to the equivalent of what solar PV does for electricity, not enabling entirely infrastructure-free power, or what smartphones do for information, enabling basically now 5 billion people to have supercomputers in their pockets that give them access to all of the world's information. How do we do that in water? And so that's when we set out to go develop a technology that was entirely infrastructure-free, no wires in, no pipe in, and yet water out. And so I'll talk a little bit more about the company later, but just sort of from a problem statement perspective, it's a sort of grand challenge framed out, starting in the lab. We named the company Zero Mass Water, which is sort of after our cultural element of zero mass, the idea that basically you have to stay inertia-free and entirely data-driven at every moment if you're really going to solve big problems. You can't be focused on solutions out of the gates.
Excellent. Carl, how about for you? What is the problem?
So one of the big problems that we think about quite a bit is very similar to the water scarcity, is getting food to market. And I don't think a lot of people realize this, but not far from here is really the salad bowl of the United States, Salinas, California, where the majority of fresh produce is grown. A little bit south of here is Yuma, Arizona, where the rest of it is grown. And in those both of those geographies today, about 20 or 30% of all the food that is grown is abandoned in the field due to a shortage of labor. And so if you think about the energy that goes into growing food, the water that goes into growing into food, the effort, the people who don't have access to food in the world, and we plow under about 30% of fresh, nutritious, healthy produce in the United States annually. And so what we're trying to do is bring automation to solve that labor shortage. And the big problem there is, how do you get a robot that can handle in a way that doesn't damage food, can get it to market, and in a food-safe way? And I think that's something we've become very aware of in the last couple of weeks, is really the contamination of E. coli, salmonella, and other pathogens in the food supply chain. And so at Soft Robotics, we use our technology that we've translated out of Harvard University to really enable autonomous systems, robots, for lack of a better word, to solve for that labor scarcity, bring that food to market, and do it in a way that is cleanable, safe, and increases the safety margin in the food supply chain today.
Excellent. So if I were just to summarize a little bit for you guys, what I hear common, when I look at the size of the problem, providing clean drinking water for all in society, for all human beings as a right, as Cody said, feeding the planet and addressing it as Carl said, those are really grand problems. So check the box on that. And they're not just societal human problems, they're also big businesses. I can't help but look at the fact that I got 3 bottles of water sitting here. My guess is that if I checked everyone in the audience, about a third of you, if not half, also have some water with you or just outside the door. Huge business opportunities. So there's also the problem from a market standpoint, not just societal. And what Carl said, I can't seem to turn and bump into something without hearing something about AI and robotics. Tremendous market opportunities, but not so easy necessarily to solve them and actually get your technology commercialized. So you got to find the right technology. So on that, Cody, everybody knows clean drinking water is a major issue all around the world, including here in the United States. So where did the technology come from?
Yeah, so in my research group at the university, we really start out with this sort of problem statement that has now become the vision of the company, which is to perfect water for every person, every place. And so what that meant was we had to really rethink, how could we drive a resource that up till now, we're basically still living in the Roman era, right? We wait for the stuff to fall out of the sky, soak into the ground, pump it, treat it, send it down a pipe to your home or to the place where that thing is then filled up and then put into a package and then driven somewhere else, et cetera. How do we break that whole theory? And so really thinking about, from a material science perspective, how could we do this passively? How could we leverage the fact that there are 10 to the 17, so 1 and then 17 0 kilograms of water vapor in the troposphere, the lowest part of the atmosphere. Massive amount of water, more fresh water in the atmosphere than all the fresh rivers in the world, right? And so how do we leverage that in a way that doesn't invoke a bunch of electricity, that enables us to go from the driest deserts in the world to the wettest jungles in the world and solve this problem for everybody? So now going from the lab to the marketplace, we're now in 18 countries, right, and growing. And keep in mind, when you mention bottled water as a big business, 500 billion liters a year of that stuff are sold. And it's not, the primary market is not soccer moms in Wichita loading cases of bottled water into the back of a minivan. The primary market is people in the emerging markets who have jobs, they're making a few $1,000s a year, they have a home, a spouse, children, they go to school, children go to school, they go to work, and they live a life that's very similar to all of ours, it's just more modest. The one thing that's really different is their infrastructure sucks, and so their primary mechanism for getting good drinking water is bottled water. So how do we think about breaking that circle of high cost and great deal of waste?
Carl, what about for you? Technically, so robotics, like I mentioned, who doesn't want to, robotics is just a cool term. So where did the technology come for you?
So it's interesting. I'll tell you the other problem. So we've got the grand problem of we've got to get food to market. We've got to feed the world. We've got to stop plowing under fresh produce. So then the sub-problem is, okay, how do we get a robot to pick up delicate items? And this has been a decades-long endeavor, and we've done it by creating what I like to call the Terminator hand, right? We're going to create a mechanical replication of the human hand, and my numbers may be off, but I think there's 20-something bones, 30-something muscles, and 44 nerve structures in the human hand. So we picked the most difficult structure, one of the most difficult structures in the world to replicate, but that's what we knew. But the problem was, how do I handle these delicate objects? And material science out of the Whitesides Research Group at Harvard, George Whiteside's one of the 16 chaired professors at Harvard University. George flipped it on its head. He said, why are we trying to replicate the most complex structure in the human body? Well, let's find a simple structure that's very good at picking things up. The octopus, the squid. And so George was an expert in material science. He was an expert in microfluidics. By combining different layers of materials, applying different pressures with microfluidics, created the field of soft robotics, which now enables a robot to have a octopus-like grab on something. So while we continue to work on building this mechanical hand that's expensive, complex, and continues to damage and crush tomatoes and heads of lettuce, we now have this octopus-inspired material science-based innovation that has completely enabled that grasping and is bringing food to market today as we sit here.
Got it. So I'm going to do it again. I'm going to summarize a little bit technically because, and also let you in on something here. I mean, so I've had the pleasure and still do to work with both of these guys. So when Cody says that we're asked him where's the technology, basically very humbly states out of his lab at Arizona State, the largest engineering department in the United States in terms of in academia. I remember when I first came to see you when there was barely a company and you had a, crude, I would say, maybe prototype at that point where perhaps you can do a liter worth of water per day. I don't know, I can't remember exactly the amount, but it was definitely, the technology was early, but it was pretty incredible. It was 107 degrees in basically the desert that I showed up in July, and there's this thing that looked like a solar panel, but it was generating water, not just electricity. And by the way, they're exhibiting outside, so you can see many generations past the actual product on this. And so that was the technology. And then I come around to Carl, and I had a same thing. I've had the pleasure of working with Carl, and I can remember what initially was this, as he calls, human hand that was this endeavor, and what it's now evolved into. Is actually quite spectacular if you look at the videos or you see it live with customers and so forth. So early stage technology, both out of universities, Arizona State, in your case, Harvard University. That's part of the recipe. Let's turn the page now to the third piece, which is actually bridging the gap to commercialization. I just mentioned that technology that I saw Cody, initially I could see the promise, but it certainly wasn't a product. And you mentioned how many countries, 16 different countries that you're in today, which is quite impressive. And before I ask you to expand a little bit, I just want to say, Carl, give you a chance. How many different customers now have used your robotic hand?
So we have greater than 120 customers, which is, we love that number, but for us, it's the number of factories that are running. So there's more than 30 factories now around the world that have incorporated soft robotics technology to solve their problems.
Yeah, so it's come a long way. So now we want to hear a little bit about, Cody, how did you bridge the gap to commercialization, 16 different countries?
18.
18. See, I'm dated a little bit. 2 countries have been added pretty quickly. So go ahead.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple sort of principles, and then kind of as we get into later stages, sort of how we think about evolving these businesses in a way that really builds for multi-decade or century type company building, right? So the first thing is that early prototype you saw, right? That was probably only 1 or 2 generations before our MVP, our minimum viability product, right? And I think probably most people have heard, right? If you're not embarrassed by your minimum viability product, then you've waited too long. The first thing that we did, right? So we were at the university. We incorporated. We were still at the university. We rented a little shop, like 800 square foot shop. We pulled a bunch of all-nighters for 6 weeks, and we built 50 source hydro panels, the name of the product. And these panels then got put into crates and flown to Jordan and to Ecuador. And we had, even at that early days, we had a modem texting to a Gmail account, SMS to Gmail. So we had real-time data. And the very first site we installed at was a place called Mafraq, which is right on the Syrian border. This is in early 2015. So these are the early days of the Syrian refugee crisis. There's people literally coming under the fence while we're putting in these panels. We then drove to the lowest point on Earth in Kafrain, which is at the Dead Sea, and then 8 other sites. Then we flew from there, I like to say directly, but we had to land at JFK first, down to Guayaquil and install in the slums of Guayaquil, where the first people that were of extraordinarily modest means started to engage with our product. So that enabled us to, from the very earliest days, see real people interacting and be in very different environments, from Middle Eastern desert to equatorial jungle type conditions out of the gates, which was super painful, but compressed probably 3 or 4 years of learning into 6 months.
It's pretty impressive, Not non-trivial, so I'm going to come back to that. And Carl?
I could agree more with that process, and I think that is one of the things that we really struggle with when academic technology, because in academia we're technologists and we're enamored by the technology, and you write papers and you want to talk technology. When you transition into that product company stage, you have to put on a different hat, which is not create world-changing technology, is take care of your customers and your customers will take care of you. And that's what I tell people all the time, is exactly what you said, is go to the customer early, go to the customer often. And if the customer says, I understand this is a prototype, I understand it's not there, but it's doing something I've never seen done before. It's pulling water out of thin air in the desert. It is harvesting lettuce. It is packaging food. It is automating these things. That's where that real moment starts. And I think that then you compress that learning and you keep moving. But that's what we talk about all the time, is take care of the customer will take care of the company.
Carl makes a super solid point, right? So as academics, we sort of think of the publishing of the paper as the end. Really, it's like not even 1% of the job to be done, which is one of the reasons why I really like my style of academia, which is we do it at the bench and we take it all the way out, right? And the factor that is the other 99% is the humans on the other side that matter, right? As long as you can remove the human from the equation, it's a sterile environment, it's really easy, you can get all kinds of awards and feel like a big shot, but it doesn't fundamentally solve anything. It doesn't solve anything until you've actually gotten it into humans' hands and you start to solve human problems and start to partner with people that are going to be using the product or selling the product or living with the product in our case. Yeah. So it's a huge element of really being ultimately successful, is that human factor, integrating back into the technology and iterating as rapidly as possible and getting those MVPs out there to start to learn.
And you can't go soon enough.
That's right.
Yeah.
Let's take that last statement, you can't go soon enough. And let's build off of that. So here we are in the third section. We talked about outlining the problem, both from a societal human factor. We talked about where do you source the technology. In Cody's case, he invented it. In Carl's case, he found someone that was brilliant, and he could identify the fact that that was at least one, if not the solution for the problems that he was addressing. And then here we are on how do you bridge the gap commercially. And you can't go soon enough to customers, to which Cody says, let's get even deeper, humans that actually use the product, benefit from the product, make the product. Both of these two gentlemen, I will say, I talk about the recipe for material impact, my firm, and I say problem set first, technology next, and then bridging the gap. What's almost obvious, perhaps, to all of you is then it takes special people who can actually execute on this, both as individuals and hire and recruit the right team around them. So I can say, Cody, I remember you immediately going outside of the U.S. to, as you mentioned, on anywhere in the world and figuring out how do I get people in this area, the human beings, that customer, to use it. Carl, I can remember the same with you going wherever the target customer may be, and then really listening to the customer and building that product. So that's the third piece. The bridging the gap is as soon as possible engaging with customers, humans, users. One thing you guys didn't say that I'll say for you because I've had a chance to interact with you, you also have to manufacture this at scale. And each of you, I know, has looked at, where do we go? How do we design a process by which we can actually have this, I'm going to correct myself, in 18 countries, and correct myself again, not how many customers, over 30 factories, right? And so that's another thing that you guys did early. So with the last little bit of time that we've got here, maybe I just want to summarize a bit. The first thing is I'd like everyone, here or listening, to leave understanding that going after really tough problems, again, things that keep the world healthy, safe, fed, warm, secure, empowered, the kind of things that seem almost impossible to address because they're so hard. Not only is it possible, as evidenced here, it's exciting. These guys are very passionate, and there's a recipe that one can have to be successful. So I want to, hopefully people have hope around the solutions that are around the corner or in existence. The second piece that I would say is, the meaningfulness in terms of impact in society. I can see a whole trend now where lots of products matter, where you not only make them, but this session is around resiliency. You need to make them where if you have clean drinking water in the slums of a particular location in the world, or in Flint, Michigan, right? If you have robotics somewhere on the West Coast in the factories, or if you have them overseas somewhere, that they're actually pretty resilient and robust. They withstand both human interaction, interference, or even just generally speaking, they deal with Mother Nature in a way that they stick around. So if something happens in a place like Puerto Rico, or in the United States or elsewhere, people still have clean drinking water, and people still have food. So on that, let me wrap up, and maybe we can take some questions. And thank you, gentlemen, both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carmichael. Now, Cody, I'm going to ask you to answer the question, but just to be polite to our next group, I'm going to suggest that we move out into the audience to take us off officially from the stage.
All right.